Good morning. Gonna wait for just a couple of minutes. I hope you're all having a wonderful morning so far. Question of the week, if you're already tuned in. Do you have a mindfulness practice? And if so, what does it look like? So, hello there. If you're new to this world, I'm Bree, and every Monday morning I come on and talk about something that is worth talking about and drink coffee or tea. I actually have tea this morning because I already had a cup of coffee, and if I have 2 cups of coffee, I don't know what would happen. So I make really strong coffee, so I essentially already had like 3 cups of coffee. We're going to talk about liminality today, which is a concept that originated in anthropology. It arose from several sources kind of at once, but the figure that it's frequently attached to is Joseph Campbell. And basically a liminal space, first of all, liminality comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. So it's a space that's in between no longer and not yet, if that makes any sense. So it's this in-between space. Summer for school kids is an example of a liminal space. It's a very benign example of liminal space. But it's basically anytime you're in between things. So if you're in between jobs, or if you're in between days even, liminal space, you're at a threshold of change. So you can always use liminal space to change. And it started as an anthropological term. It can be used in the realm of political science. It can be used in a lot of different things. You can hear that, that's the garage. It's very noisy, but it will be done shortly. I did my master's in classical violin, but I essentially wrote an ethnomusicology master's thesis, and I talked a lot about liminality, especially in the classical canon. And so a lot can happen in liminal spaces. It's ideal for growth. A lot of growth happens in liminal spaces if you let it. So it takes work for growth to happen in liminal spaces. And in order for that growth to happen, you have to combat something that is actually a law of physics, which is entropy. And the second law of thermodynamics, stick with me, states that chaos increases over time unless you're willing to do work. So essentially, unless you put in work, everything gets more and more chaotic. You can apply this to how clean your room is, and you can apply this to literally anything in your life, but it applies to liminal spaces as well. So if you're in a liminal space and you're not willing to do the work, things can get really chaotic. If you're in a liminal space and you are doing the work, then things synthesize, things start to move forward. And so liminal spaces can be a really dark place to be. And I don't mean that in a depression sort of way. I just mean that in a sense that it's really hard to see where the path forward is. It's like you're on this hiking trail and you're just enveloped in fog and you're not sure where to go. So it can be a dark place. I have a quote from Angela of Foligno, who lived in the 13th century. And she said, "When I'm in that darkness, I do not remember anything about being human." So an aspect of liminal space is also this idea that there's inherent irrationality in liminal space. And it's irrational because it takes us out of everything we know and puts us in this space that frequently incites a lot of fear responses in us. So it's easy to lean on irrationality. But if you use that irrationality to build a new future, your building blocks are very, very flawed, right? So you have to, when you're in these liminal spaces, part of the work is recognizing that your first instincts might be very, very irrational, and working to combat that irrationality with a lot of space and a lot of deep breaths and a lot of things that slow you down in the moment, so you figure out how to move forward. Bree, what are you even talking about? I'm so glad you asked. I'm talking about the concept of liminality. So it's an in-between space. And it can also be moving into the socio-political realm. Its liminal spaces can be characterized by the dislocation of established structures, changes in hierarchies or powers, and uncertainty about traditions and continuation of the future. So all of these things are aspects of our reality right now, right? We're in a very uncertain place. We don't know where we're going to move forward. We are in a very liminal space. And I've got a lot of links in where, just depending on where you're watching this, there's a list of sources that if you want to explore the concept of liminality more, you're welcome to. I feel like this is a brief tangent. This is on, for those of you on other platforms, the Periscope world is going crazy right now. I'm going to check to make sure that Facebook is working, because I'm not totally sure that it is. Ooh. As everything falls over. I'll give you a moment to synthesize things that I've been saying. Oh no, we're there. Good deal. All right. So recognizing that we're in this liminal space right now, and liminal has nothing to do with Illuminati. It can be used to examine power. It can be used to examine exclusion. It can be used to examine protest movements and social movements. And so it can also have a huge impact on our art forms. So when we're in these liminal spaces, it's hard to make art that we've been making, right? We're pushed to make art that we haven't made yet, that hasn't been made yet. And we see this in 20th century increased polyphony. In music, it can start to represent this sense that we're in a societally dark place. We're not sure where we're going. We're not sure what's going to be there on the other side. So the context that we're in has a very real effect on the art that we make. You can argue that you are always in a liminal space if you choose to be. And if you're familiar with Richard Rohr, he is somebody he runs the Center for Action and Contemplation out in New Mexico, and he had a great series on liminality in April, and why it's really important. He would say, seek it out as much as you possibly can. He would call it a part of the perichoresis, or this divine dance, which is also, I would say, analogous to sort of a tripartite Hegelian dialectic, which maybe we'll unpack that in another Monday morning coffee session. But basically, it's this idea that we think we know who we are. We develop this sense of self, and then inevitably life challenges that, and life challenges who we think we are. And that challenges the liminal space. How we respond to that challenge, how we move forward, is a sort of synthesis. And this process just repeats over and over and over again throughout our entire lives. We're being challenged right now. A huge question is, how do we want to move forward in this space? How much work are we willing to put in? The more work you do, the deeper the synthesis that it is. And I would argue that this is a really spiritual practice, right? It's not going somewhere once a week to affirm yourself. It's going into this, it's going into the wilderness. It's going into this dark, potentially dark or foggy, or however you want to however you want to envision that. It's going into the wilderness and seeing what we find in the darkness, seeing if we can sit with that and letting it be a teacher to us and letting it teach us how to be better humans, essentially. So it's not a fear-free practice. It can be something that incites a lot of fear, and it's because we frequently respond to stimulus in our environment from the amygdala, which is the part in our brain that is the fight, flight, freeze response. And so as you're moving through the world and you find these challenges to yourself, that's a very, if you're being challenged at the core of your being, your response to that is, this is a threat to my identity. This is a threat to who I am. And so your first response is to live in this part of your brain that was really, really useful when we were being chased by lions, and it's not nearly as useful today. It occasionally is good. It's part of us. It's part of how we work. But it's this space that can be very hard to control and very hard to recognize that you're in. So there's this fraction of a second of when we're in fight, flight, freeze that we can step back and choose where we're going to fall. And we can choose to fall completely outside of that. We can choose to enter a liminal space instead. So instead of following our lizard brains, as it's sometimes called, we can choose to take this other path. And it requires more work, and it requires more discomfort, and it requires sitting with these things that we frequently don't want to sit with. But it's a path that takes us out of fight, flight, freeze and into something that has way more growth potential, way deeper potential for meaningful life, right? So we have choices. We can work to recognize when we're in liminal spaces, and it's largely what I'm talking about is crafting a mindfulness practice. So being aware of where you're feeling things in your body, being aware of what emotions come up in any given situation. And we're presented with so many of them on social media, especially these days. But just recognizing these things that come up in your body, and then working to expand the space around those feelings so you have more control over how you respond to them. And when you have more control over how you respond to them, you can choose to enter this liminal space. And side note, of course, there are a million things surrounding liminal space that it's not always safe to do this work, right? So if you're suffering trauma, if you're suffering from racism, or if these things, if you cannot exist safely in the world, then it's not always going to be the right thing to choose that liminal space. But especially in the United States, if you are a white person in the US, if you're doing anti-racist work, it's so important to create this space to choose liminality, because this is where we can really get that work done. And it goes beyond just posting on social media, and it goes beyond anything we can do online. It creates that space that lets us pause when we want to type some really incendiary thing to somebody who said something that we don't like. We have that space, and we can choose to move forward in a way that's productive. So it's this concept of moving in a Joseph Campbell sense along the arc of life, in a sense that, in a way that you are learning from the challenges that come up and moving forward, rather than just going in a circle. And that the circle is something that's present in a lot of cultures. So in the yoga tradition, for example, it's called a samskara, where you're stuck in this cycle. And I would argue that that's just the chaos of entropy. That's us choosing to not do the work. And so we get stuck, and we all do it. We all do it with different things, with varying, to varying degrees. And it's human. It's entirely human. But with awareness, it's something that we can move through and into a better space for literally everybody. So, with that said, kind of a shorter one this morning, but I'm going to leave you with that because it's dense. And I really enjoy talking about liminality and liminal spaces. So if you have any questions, drop them in the comments. Check out the sources that I posted. Check out Richard Rohr's whole series on liminality if you're interested. And that's that. There's no live stream this week. I will see you next Monday for another coffee talk. Have a great week, everybody.